So in this episode, we are going to talk about the axioms of IIT. Last time the focus was what we call, let's say, our foundations page on the IIT Wiki, where we present this a concept we call the zeroth axiom, which is the starting place of everything for IIT, simply that experience exists immediately and irrefutably. And from this basis, the fact that experience exists, our first step in IIT is to try to identify what properties of experience we could call essential properties, in the sense that they are immediate and irrefutably true of not only every experience we've ever had, but every experience we can conceive of possibly having. So in IIT, these are known as the five axioms. We more or less use the phrase axiom and essential property of experience. We more or less use these phrases interchangeably. Yeah, without much ado, I think we'll jump into them.
As a reminder to our overall goal, we can say that IIT, rather than trying to find some physical property that can explain why consciousness emerges or is generated by the brain, IIT starts from consciousness itself, tries to describe its properties, and then formulates these properties in physical terms. And the description of the properties of experience, that's the part that the axioms are covering, right? And if we describe consciousness, so each individual experience as a structure, then we can separate its essential properties, the ones that are true of every conceivable experience, and then the properties that characterize this particular experience that is structured in this specific way. For instance, when you're seeing color or tasting coffee, and that will account for what we call the accidental properties of consciousness, or the properties of a specific experience that are not true of every conceivable experience. So when we talk about a phenomenal structure, we want to identify both the essential and accidental properties, and the axioms are covering the essential ones. So we can start by going one by one through the axioms.
But
And
before we do, so this word axiom, we mentioned in a previous episode already, but it's also worth mentioning again, because people have all sorts of preconceptions of what this word axiom means or should mean. So we should be very clear that in IIT, we use this in a, let's say, slightly idiosyncratic way. The part of it that is normal is just the general sense of an axiom being a starting point for an argument, right? Or starting point. And however, in other fields, for example, in mathematics, the way the word axiom most often appears is simply a stipulation within a certain conceptual system or mathematical system, which may or may not be true. There's not, it's simply stipulated. Whereas in IIT, this is where it's a bit idiosyncratic perhaps, we double down on it as being, we use this word, or these words, immediate and irrefutably true of every conceivable experience. So we say these axioms are not just stipulations, they're not just propositions, but we can be sure that they are true because because they are indeed confirmed within our own experience. We don't have to defer or refer to any other extrinsic or alternative source of evidence for them. Simply, they are immediately true in our own experience. So I don't know if you guys want to, before we get into the axioms, to dig more into that a bit.
I can add one thing. So let's say from a philosophical perspective, and as you said, maybe philosophy of mathematics, the notion of axiom is actually pertinent in this case, because so you can think about axioms in different ways. When you have a logical argument, you can think you go from some premises to some conclusions, and your premises can be based on some other reasoning, so they can be the outcome of a different argument, of a different reasoning, or they can be just axioms in the sense that they are foundational truths that you just accept as true without further further defense or grounding. And this connects, for instance, to the notion of axioms and also postulates. Sometimes they're using interchangeably in mathematics and geometry. So you can think about the parallel postulates in Euclidean geometry, right? That says that if you have given a line and a point that is not on that line, then there is exactly one line through that point that is parallel to the given line. And you can take this as true and end up with Euclidean geometry, if you, of course, use the other axioms of Euclidean geometry, or you can consider it as not true and then have non-Euclidean geometry. So the truth of this axiom in particular is, as you say, it's a stipulation. For IIT, though, the word axiom is taken in its meaning of a foundational truth that is not grounded in further truths, and it is also not by stipulation. So you can't really argue that an axiom is false. An axiom is self-evident. It is irrefutable in the sense that it justifies itself. And in this case, I mean, the source of the truth of an axiom is experience itself. Like, experience is one way, and therefore you start from the fact that experience is this way, has these properties as your starting point. You don't need to justify it further. You just take experience at face value with its properties.
So does this mean that you can't have non-Tononian experience in the same sense that you could have non-Euclidean geometry?
Yeah, you can't. It's if IIT is correct, you cannot have a non-IIT description of experience, because you should be able to figure out that that's just not how experience is.
So that is just not an experience then. Is that kind of the idea, right?
Yeah.
So in the sense that geometry is something that is extrinsically defined, so to speak, I would guess. So that is the difference, right? So the experience is not something that we kind of propose or suggest or may find useful as a framework for further analysis. It's some sort of some phenomenon, natural phenomenon that actually exists, and it's here and right here in this immediate way. And it's not like we propose this thing called consciousness and we propose that it has all of these properties, but you could in principle propose other properties. That is not how it works here, right? It's more like you take the experience that is right here, right now for you in this very moment, and you try to figure out what are its properties, right? And any other.
If I can say one thing about that, I think it's a useful point to interject that we have a very strict crucible to determine what is and what is not an axiom, in fact, right? So, referring back to your point here, Björn, that you brought up, indeed, we say this phrase, you'll see it in the literature, that an axiom should be irrefutably true of any conceivable experience. And in that phrase is packed quite a lot of rich conceptual, or rich ideas. But an easy way to remember this is to think back on basically the Cartesian method, right? The same classic cogito argument that Descartes made. I think, therefore I am. And if I try to doubt this, I can indeed try. But in the process of doubting, I end up confirming that indeed I am, or in IIT's framing, I'm having an experience. And so we use this exact same crucible. So when we say it's irrefutably true of every conceivable experience, what we'll do when we go through each of these axioms is that we will try to conceive of an experience that does not have this particular quality. And if in the process of doing that, we end up reconfirming this axiom, we end up doing what in mathematics is called proof by contradiction sometimes. And so we end up reconfirming indeed the truth of the axiom. So in that sense, they are meant to be not only true within the Tononian system, or however you jokingly called it, but really of any conceivable experience. There's no alternative reality of experiences which would somehow possibly be able to have additional properties that aren't, or additional essential properties. That's an important addition there, that aren't already covered by these ones.
Just to go back to geometry as an analogy, you can take the axioms as having as expressing essential properties. So for instance, if we want to study triangles, you have to say, well, what are the essential properties of what makes a triangle a triangle? And you can say, well, it must have 3 edges and it must have 3 vertices, and the internal sum of the angles must be 180 degrees, right? So you can and that's it. It's the fact that a triangle is blue or red. Well, that's not a defining property of a triangle. Of course, there can be triangle that can be blue or red, and of course there can be things that can satisfy a subset of the properties, but these are not triangles. So it's a little bit like we're studying consciousness and we are asking, what are the essential properties of consciousness that are you know, each of them is necessary and they are jointly sufficient. So you take all of them and that describes consciousness. And then of course the axioms, besides being expressing essential properties, they also play a methodological role. And that's actually, I think, why the word axiom then is kicks in a sense, because you can use them as a premise for your investigation. So you can start from these truths and then you can do things with them. So you can actually study consciousness, you can formulate these properties in physical terms, and you can even reason and say, well, if this is the case, if all these properties are there, then I can derive other properties. And in this case, they are the accidental properties that you can study and you don't need, you can account for without any additional ingredients.
All right, so number 1 is called intrinsicality. So just reading it, we say experience is intrinsic, it exists for itself. Do either of you want to try to explain what we mean by this?
Okay, so
Yeah.
one thing we should also say is that the axioms are sometimes, they sound trivial, they sound hard sometimes to articulate because they capture a property that is so banal in a sense, so trivial of experience that it's even hard to think, why should we spend so much time cashing it out in these terms? But for intrinsicality, I think there is some background in philosophy. So philosophers have recognized since Descartes and even before that experience is subjective. It is from the first person perspective of a subject. It is private, and somehow it is only the subject has this privileged access to it. And what I'm trying to say with all these
so with those adjectives,
characterizations,
right, are you treating those as sort of alternative words that mean something similar to intrinsicality in IIT?
I think they try to they get to something similar. So the idea is that if I close my eyes, I'm meditating, or I'm just there, right? And I am having an experience. This experience somehow is independent from what's going on outside. Let's say I am not listening to anything, I'm not seeing anything, I am just having my thoughts, I'm lost in my thoughts, let's say. So the idea is that I have this experience that is going on for me. It might be very hard for somebody who is not me to know what is going on for me. And it is private in this sense. I would have to say, to verbalize, to let somebody else know. And it is from my first person perspective, right? I have this experience, I have direct access to it, I have to do nothing to have these experiences, just there. That's what I am. And I think intrinsicality gets to this idea that there is an intrinsic perspective, it is first personal, it is for the experiencer, and that's why we use this first person perspective view in the image to describe this property. You can then ask the question, okay, but could it be that this just happens to be a contingent property of my experience? Can't I have an experience that it is not private, that it is not first personal, that I don't have direct access and privileged access to, that is not for me, for the experiencer? And the answer is no to all these questions. It would end up being not an experience, or at least it would be a different experience for a different subject of experience, or different experiencer.
Right.
But
so,
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
can I just interject there? Because the axiom says it's for itself, right? It doesn't say it's for the experiencer, which is a bit of a different meaning. I think, at least, because there is a sneaky equivalence put in there between the experiencer and the experience, because the axiom is saying that it's for the experience, right? If you kind of read it explicitly, it says the experience is for the experience. It's for itself. It's not for the one having the experience, but it's for the experience. If you stay on the phenomenal thing level, right? And the moment we start talking about there's another person or another subject or another experiencer having the experience, we're pushing against it I wouldn't call it a straw man, but it's using different terms, right? And it's very, very easy or useful to talk about the experiencer, the subject, the self, the one having the experience, but then we are immediately referring to something other than itself. Do you have any thoughts about this objection?
Yeah, so I think a useful word that Matteo also brought up already is the idea of just perspective, where we're not, with this idea of intrinsicality, we're certainly not trying to smuggle in, certainly not any notion of a self, or even the need for example, metacognition. People might think of that as something we're, somehow alluding to here. But just this really stripped down notion that any experience you have, it has a perspective. And that is, for lack of a better term, your perspective, right? As the experience or the experiencer's perspective, or the perspective of the experience itself, right? From the inside out. You see me grasping at other, whatever phrases I can use to try to point to this ineffable idea. In the end, it is ineffable because any of these words sort of isn't quite right. But for me, this notion of perspective is a useful anchor for the concept.
But I do also think like this, this point of view or this perspective, it's also kind of going beyond the axiom, I feel, and which is kind of fine. And I think we always need to kind of use terminology and words that aren't quite right, like you said, in order to understand the concepts. But it's like if we go back a little bit to the zeroth axiom, right? That we take the experience to exist, and if that's all we have for now, that is what we have, right? An experience exists, and what can we say about this experience? Well, the experience is there for itself. I mean, it's not dependent on the existence of anything else. It appears because it's just there for itself, right? It's there. Regardless of whether you can think of other things existing or whatever, it's just like the experience is there for itself without any other requirements, so to speak. Maybe that is helpful. It's because you don't really need to start referring to the experiencer or the subject or anything. It's just like the experience is there.
Right. Okay, but with the word perspective, for me, you can have a perspective without there being a self involved or an experiencer per se.
The problem for me with this notion of the perspective or the point of view, it almost immediately requires some sort of spatial nature to the experience, as in you put yourself in a point and then it's stretching out from there, and and at least for me, that there you have these other theories of like perspectival I don't remember like this Fristonian idea, where that's an essential property of having a perspective, and the experience is kind of located, and then from there you kind of radiate out. And I get it, and I think that's it's a way to talk about it, but I don't think it's really what it's getting at, the axiom, for me at least. But it's really hard to articulate for me.
Well, so I agree with you that talking about perspective, the fact that it's subjective, some form of first person point of view, I think these are helping you, definitely, because experience is not third personal. It is not from nowhere. Like there is at least there is some content, there seems to be a point of view, even if this point of view is disembodied, even if there is no self. Like this is all fine. So it'll be like the eye that looks, but it doesn't see itself. There needs to be no eye in the sense of physical eye, like seeing device. But I agree with you that in saying that an experience is intrinsic, what we mean in a sense is unpacking even just the cogito argument that is, for all we know, there could be just my experience existing in the universe. It would just be this thing with its contents, and that's it. It is what it is in the sense that it comes in this form that seemed to be something I'm experiencing. But there could be no I, there could be no subject. It is just this existing, this experiencing going on independent from everything else. I think that's the part of intrinsicality that really defines the content of the axiom without necessarily implying a self, a subject, an experiencer, even though these things are useful to talk about. And so one thing that we could mention, in fact, is that even though most of the time when we're having an experience, we do have a sense of self, we do have a sense of personal identity, autobiographical memory, we know where we are located, etc. And we might even be thinking, I am having this experience of the color red. There are some states called flow states where all these contents are absent. And for instance, when you are skydiving or you're climbing, or there are these moments where there is no thinking going on, there is just being. And in this case, that experience is still intrinsic. It is still satisfying the axiom.
Yeah. In fact, I would even double down on it to say it's not only still intrinsic, but it's probably a more pure sample of what we really mean by intrinsic, right? Because it doesn't have these superimposed additional ideas, like you said, of metacognition or sense of self or whatever else.
Yeah.
So
and I think just to remind, because you already did kind of a attempt at contradicting this, right? But I think in the contradiction we used very strongly these notions of other subjects having the experience and so on and so forth. So maybe could we just try once more to do the contradiction, just trying to rely only on these notions of an experience being for not itself, but for, what would it be? Another experience, right? So if it wasn't for itself, it would be for another experience, or for another, could it be even anything else, right? I mean, if it was for another experience, what you would end up with, I think, is that the experience then would be for that other experience, and the experience by virtue of that is for itself, because the new experience, in a sense, is in fact for itself still. It's just for another experience, and that is kind of a contradiction and a weird thing. It's like this experience is for the experience itself, but if it were for another experience, I mean, then it would in fact be for that experience, which is for itself, just and
while we're on the while we're talking about the problems of language, of trying to articulate this without using these kinds of words and so on, Matteo, could you offer a brief, I mean, we don't want to make it a rabbit hole, but I think it's useful to have a brief contrast of how we in IIT use this word intrinsic compared to ways that it often appears in philosophy, or has appeared?
Yeah, sure. There is, of course, a very big literature on the metaphysics of intrinsic versus extrinsic properties, and this goes back to Aristotle and Plato. And an important piece of the debate was revolving around the notion of intrinsicality that, for instance, David Lewis discussed. And one thing to mention perhaps is that the main definition of something of a property being intrinsic is that it is independent from what is called accompaniment. So it's basically the idea that a property is intrinsic if it doesn't depend on the existence of another entity that is separate from the entity you're talking about that has the intrinsic property. So for instance, just to make it very concrete, being a brother is not an intrinsic property, because for me to be a brother, there has to be another entity in the universe that is independent from me, which is my brother, that makes me also be a brother. And similarly, something like being taller than is not an intrinsic property, because if I am the only thing that exists in the universe and there's nothing that I am taller than, then I don't have that property anymore. Some intrinsic properties in this sense that are independent from something else are, for instance, the shape. Some philosophers have argued the shape of an entity is an intrinsic property, doesn't depend on there being something else in the universe. Perhaps being an electron could also be considered an intrinsic property. And what I want to highlight is that this notion of intrinsicality is not necessarily incompatible with the notion of IIT. In a sense, it is true that experience being intrinsic means that it doesn't really depend fully on something else existing, although that doesn't mean that experience is not affected by other things. And in terms of phenomenology, this is harder to describe, but in terms of postulates, so we will get there in the later episodes, but it is better to use the example of course, the fact that if I open my eyes, I see something out there in the world, and this affects my experience. This means that my experience is affected, but the content of my experience is affected by something else, but it doesn't mean that my experience per se depends on the cup on the table, right? And
you could be dreaming. You could be dreaming.
I could be dreaming, or
sense.
exactly. I could just be completely internally generated. Another thing is that the fact that my experience exists could depend on background conditions. So I could say the fact that there is oxygen in my brain and blood circulating and all the neurotransmitters are in place and are doing their thing, well, in a sense, my experience depends on these things, but that doesn't make it less intrinsic. It is still for itself. It is still the way in which my experience is from within is still there. So again, the notion of intrinsicality doesn't mean that experience doesn't depend on other things.
Can I ask you one question about this also? Would it be accurate to say that from IT's perspective, the way that intrinsic has been used in these ways that you just gave examples of, this would be an extrinsic perspective on things in the world, right? And I just mentioned, maybe you want to unpack that or something, but I mentioned this because we'll see in certainly in future episodes, but also throughout IIT literature, you see this contrast between intrinsic and extrinsic, intrinsic perspective, extrinsic perspective. I don't know, maybe it's a useful little flag to plant at this point that from IIT's perspective, or at least the way we try to use this word intrinsic, in contrast with the established literature, we'd say most of these other uses are actually extrinsic uses, extrinsic in the sense that they capture what we as observers observe to be properties of other things. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, it's accurate. And one last thing I want to say about intrinsicality from a philosophical perspective, I think is very interesting, is that in philosophy, intrinsicality is, let's say, it's a second order property, is a property of properties, right? I can say shape is a property and it is intrinsic because it doesn't depend on something else existing in the universe. But for IIT, intrinsicality is, if anything, you can say intrinsicality is a property of experience. And there is really only one thing, there's only one thing that satisfies intrinsicality, and this is consciousness. It is experience. It is not. So that's why you can't apply the notion of intrinsicality to a cup and say, oh, its shape is intrinsic. That is not the same notion of intrinsicality that IIT talks about. So intrinsicality is an essential property of experience, and only of experience. And this is, if something exists intrinsically, it is experience in its full sense, of course.
All right, so let's move on to the next axiom, which is information. And when I say next axiom, maybe I should clarify, we're going through the axioms in the order in which they are currently presented in IIT 4.0, in the most up-to-date formalization of the theory. Some readers will have noticed the order has shuffled a little bit at different times in the evolution of the theory, and in fact, probably the most useful way to think of them is simply as a package, right? Sometimes we'll say first, second, third axiom, but actually there isn't really a inherent ordering to them per se. We do have a certain ordering because on the methodological side, or on the physics side of the ledger, which we'll come to later, we will see that it indeed makes sense to kind of go through them in a certain order. And I think that is a sensible reason why we address them in this order with the axiom on the axiom side as well. But it's important to get that there's nothing sacred about the ordering, other than that it just helps the hygiene of the overall, the conceptual hygiene of the overall project here.
And like Matteo said earlier, I think it's like they're jointly sufficient. You kind of need all of them as a pack.
I want to add one thing that I think it's interesting. I'm sorry, but it's just very briefly. So from a philosophical perspective, I think it is a legitimate question if you're asking about properties of existence. So you say, and this is Thomas Aquinas and other scholastics philosophers talked about properties of existence in similar terms, and you can ask whether something exists as one, or if something exists the way it does. Like all these kind of things are, you can ask whether one comes before the other. If there are properties that depend on each other, even though they are all essential properties. And that's an interesting question per se. So what I'm trying to say is that you can think about the order of these axioms, or which ones are, I don't know, more fundamental than others in a sense, or come before others just in pure metaphysical or even phenomenal terms. But then when it comes to the postulates, when it comes to translating these properties and having to measure them, then you hit more of a wall, in the sense that you have to apply computational steps in a sequence, right? And so there, the question of which axiom is translated first is more consequential, and is of course an attempt to just do it in the way that is more reasonable and most sensible, and also makes more sense conceptually. But definitely there is some room to ask these questions in those terms.
Okay, so the axiom of information says this: experience is specific. It is this one. Do either of you want to delve into that?
For me, it just says that experience is this particular way, right? It's always the case that an experience you have is the particular way it is. It's a very like circular seeming thing, but it's like to the extent that you can say you have one experience, you're having an experience, that experience is necessarily a particular way. It is structured in a particular way. It has a particular set of contents, and they are related in a particular way. It's not like they are both, structured in one way and another at the same time, so to speak. It's just one. It's just this particular way. And I guess
and maybe the contrast with the word generic is also perhaps helpful here. Or you say it's this way, it's this particular way, it's this specific way, right? Well, what would it mean for it not to be this specific way, right?
Well, I guess you could think of it in several ways, but for me, it's like we have these notions, especially when we start talking about the composition axiom and so on, that we have an experience is composed of distinctions and relations. They have certain contents, and they are structured in a particular way. And you could say that you could have just a bag of contents and all the possible ways that they could possibly be related to one another or structured. You could say that, oh, I have an experience with a specific set of contents related in a generic way. That seems like that is just it seems very non-specific, and generically in this way, it's like, are you then having an average experience of all these different ways that it could have been, that the contents could have been structured? It seems very weird to me. It's always necessarily structured in one of the possible ways and not in like some amalgam of all the possible ways it could have been structured, if you know what I mean.
I do. Yeah. So one thing though is the example it could be confusing because you're jumping forward, I think, to composition quite a lot with the example, which isn't bad because of course these come as a package. But you could also explore the idea with even a totally monolithic example, right? You know, something that where you don't, or at least the relations aren't apparent, let's say. So if we take a super monolithic example like pure redness, right? The experience of pure redness. So to say that this experience is specific is, as you said, Björn, what was the word you used? Or it's just very simple. It's saying it is the way it is, right? It simply is red, right? And if it were a different color, if it were green, it simply would be green, which is the way it is. And if you were then to try to have a, let's say, proper counterfactual of that idea, meaning I'm having an experience of color in a generic sense. Okay, but what would that really mean? A mix of red and blue and yellow and whatever else? But then that comes out as, I don't know, Matteo, you tell me, you're more aesthetically inclined, right? It comes out as whatever mix that is. Or if you try to say, okay, a gray experience or something, well, a gray kind of mishmash of all sorts of whatever. Well, that itself is also a specific experience of that gray.
I think Matteo has talked about like there's a philosophy in philosophy that you have this idea of blelo, I think, or what is the mix
I was
of
probably
blue and
Gru.
yellow is Gru.
Well, blelo, I think, was made up by you, no?
Mm-hmm.
No, yeah,
Yes.
blelo
Well,
is an original
have-
grasso, but you have Gru is actually an example.
Blelo exists, maybe not in philosophy, but it exists. Universal.
I hope you don't mind, Björn. I thought it was maybe good to pull us away from the
Yeah.
overly structured example, actually,
no,
too.
it's fine, but I do
would
think
say-
it's interesting because even like you said, like it's not overtly about structure, but then it also is about
Oh,
structure,
it
even
is, yeah.
right?
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
like because you would necessarily start talking about like, oh, let's say you're seeing a patch. You necessarily need to have a patch of red, right?
Yeah.
Just redness
It has extended, it
without,
has extension, yeah.
there's spatial structure, there's extendedness, there's all these things that is very. So yeah, but it's okay. I think it's better, like you said, to kind of try to just talk
Try
about
to
it as
do
a
it, yeah.
monolithic thing,
It's
and
cheating
then
a bit.
yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
maybe a good example is an experience of pure smell. Like if you are having an experience of a smell, it's very specific smell. I think that is a sort of monolithic experience. You can say the smell might have internal structure in the sense that I can recognize maybe some floral notes and some sweet notes but it is one smell. It's there, right? And let's assume that's all I am experiencing right now. So in this case, I think it's interesting because since our introspection in terms of olfactory experience sometimes it's more limited than for other modalities, we might very well not know what to call that smell. But that doesn't, we can say it reminds me of something. It is this general floral flower probably smell, but I cannot really put a label on it. And that doesn't mean that we are experiencing a generic flower smell. It might just mean that we don't know the name. Maybe we are smelling chrysanthemum, right? But we just don't know the name. But our experience is very specific. If we, for instance, if we experience a different smell that still we don't know the name of, it would feel different. But again, we wouldn't be able to say, to pinpoint it exactly. So I think we should say that an experience can never be generic. We can have an experience of something that maybe is abstract in the sense that we can say, oh, I can call this as, I know it smells like a flower. And in this case, the experience is still specific. It is the smell we are experiencing, but we just connect it to this concept that this smell reminds us of a more a general category of flowery, floral smells. But it is not generic in the sense that it is neither, I don't know, it is neither floral nor, I don't know, some nor woody, nor the smell of coffee. It's just pure generic smell. That's not, that's not possible.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So why is this axiom labeled the information axiom?
Well, I think this is a question that gets at several of the axioms actually, and I do think you mentioned like it is in part historical why the names are. There was like a brief moment in the lab where we were like, shouldn't we just like rename all the axioms now that we have these other adjectives or words that kind of are what we actually refer to, right? Like
We call this the
what
specificity axiom, for
exactly.
example. Yeah.
But so I think keeping it with the information, it has its own reasons, but it's at least in part historical. But I think it also has to do with trying to get back to the roots of what information means, and really this notion that has been left out of information theory, for example, that is the meaning of the
Yeah.
it's not only about information as message passing, but it's really getting at it's information in the sense of it's meaningful, and the meaning is specific. The meaning of an experience is truly the informative part of the experience, right? Its meaning, its information, so to speak.
Can you say when I think it might be a little confusing to talk about meaning, because meaning is usually what I mean when I say something or when I'm trying to communicate something. Like that's the meaning of a sentence, the meaning of a word. Can you connect this word meaning to the content of experience? Just to clarify, what do we mean when we say the meaning the meaning of an experience? What can you say something
What does
about
that
that?
mean?
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
no, I think when you have an experience, what it means to you is the way it appears. That is at the
The
base
way,
level.
maybe the way it feels.
The way it feels, sure. The way it feels, the feeling is the meaning. What the experience means to you is the way it appears to you, the way it feels for you, the structure it has. All of these things grasp at the same notion, and it is about the specific way it is. And I think information is a useful term there. It has this information, right? And then you can try to convey that information by starting to talk about it and trying to convey, inform others about what you're experiencing in this moment. You'll never be able to actually fully articulate, I think, for any
But
real. Yeah.
if you wasn't feeling like anything, then you couldn't possibly convey any meaning, because in a sense, like you say, if I'm experiencing, I don't know, let's say an emotion, I'm experiencing sadness and I'm trying to describe it, it's because of this feeling that means something for me, that I can try to put that into words. And when I say sadness, then it means something to you, because by the way, you probably also have experienced sadness, and so you connect my words to, you understand the meaning because you connect it to a feeling, which is, again, it's specific. And so I agree with you. I just wanted to unpack this notion, which I think is very important, that information is connected to the notion of meaning, which is connected to a feeling, which is always specific. So these words are connected to each other, and that's interesting from a computer science and information theory perspective. It is also, there's the other side, which we mentioned, that's the philosophical side, the notion of to inform. What does it mean? Well, it means to give form to something, and you can think about the fact that something is what it is by virtue of having the form it has, meaning the structure it has, the content it has. And this is a more of a philosophical Aristotelian notion, where you can say you can't have a generic substance that has no form. Like to have a specific, something is specific, is a cup or is a table, is wood or is water, because it has the form it has, the structure it has, right? So this gets also to the point that the specificity of an experience is really what defines what it is, and then you can use the word information in this sense.
Right. And of course, the way we're talking about this, we are smuggling in a little bit the ideas from the composition axiom, but I think it's also okay.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, the axioms are a package, so it is very hard to talk about experience without considering that it is composed of components and it is structured. But I think, as you say, maybe using a metaphor, we can say you can talk about a cathedral as having the specific shape it has, and then you can look at its structure and look at the bricks and look at
So when
the
you're saying the word shape or form, you're trying to say, okay, but that's sort of pre-composition, right? Pre-structural,
yeah,
right? You say, okay,
exactly.
it
You
has
can
the shape,
consider
and
the
then if you
whole.
did, okay, all right, okay, I got you.
Maybe, of course, it has components I mean, in the limit, it might have
Right,
just have
but
one
it
component
but it can
or
be
some
seen as
content.
a next step of the decomposition of it.
Yeah.
So one other point I think is important to mention about this label of information, because it's certainly generated, I think, a lot of confusion, misunderstandings, miscommunications, etc. So another point is just that there are historical reasons for this label of information, and we should level with listeners here that it has indeed, the concept of information in IIT has matured with the theory. It's evolved with the theory, and the original conception of information and integration, right? These core, let's say, pillars of the theory in the 90s. It relied, the idea of information then indeed relied a little bit more on, let's say, typical notions of information, from information theory and so on. I'm not going to say it was strictly that notion, because it was already, as Björn was mentioning, it was already bringing in this intrinsic notion of information, right, of the experiential notion of it. But if you read the original papers in the 90s, the simple notion of information would have been, I'm probably caricaturing now, it would have been something more like, red, in my experience, is what it is because it's not what it's not, right? It is what it is because it's not green or something. And it's important to say this aspect in IT it's not really axiomatic, because this relies on inference, right? Of thinking about another experience, for example, which is green, etc. And so that notion of information is more of even an extrinsic notion, right? That's relying on a secondary idea that we refer to as differentiation. And as the theory has evolved, we've teased apart these ideas, I think, more precisely to say, well, what's actually axiomatic about this idea is the notion of specificity, right? Which simply is that red is the way it is, right? Meaning that it's that and not a generic, or any experience is what it is and not generic. As a inference from that, however, in a very useful inference, we can also say experiences are differentiated from one another, right? And and so the original, just to summarize this idea, the original use of this word information more referred to this notion of differentiation, and we still, use this often, but we recognize it to be not axiomatic per se, but more of an inference. This label of information, nevertheless, somehow feels useful to maintain, for not only the reasons that you guys discussed nicely, but also simply this historical reason, right? For the clarity, for the through line of the whole theory from the 90s to now.
Yeah, and I think also this through line with this notion of differentiation, it kind of gets to stuff we'll talk about later, when it gets to quantifying the amount of information, so to speak, right? Because the amount of information in a given experience kind of depends on all the things it's not. If you had I think the classic example is comparing the experience of light and dark for a human versus the experience of light and dark for a photodiode. Where in the human case, the experience of light and dark are two out of a huge set of different possible visual experiences you could potentially be having, whilst for the photodiode, those are the only two that you could have. So by virtue of kind of not being in all the other possible experiences that you could have had, there are all, you have a large amount of information in your current experience, whilst the photodiode only has a small amount of information by virtue of kind of having the same kind of distinction. But anyways, I think that the earlier versions were more immediately getting to this quantification notion, and I think
Right. So for the keen listeners, the examples Björn is referring to here go back especially to IIT 1.0 and to some degree IIT 2.0. Yeah,
I
but I would
think
say
even
starting,
before that, even in the
yeah, complexity, yep,
yeah,
the pre-IIT
yeah,
work. Yep. But certainly with 3.0, 4.0 on, this distinction between really what is axiomatic about
yeah,
the information axiom and what is a close,
consequence.
yeah, a
Yeah,
consequence, a close consequence, but nevertheless an inference from the axiom, right? We've
yeah,
tried to be a bit more precise with that.
yeah,
Mm.
Since we're talking about the axiom, we could maybe bring up the question just for the listener and for each of us. It is interesting to remind ourselves of this question, which is, if even I was just having an experience of pure redness and that's all I knew, and let's say I came into existence, had an experience of pure redness and disappeared from existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
What, and that is a specific experience, of course, but
Mm-hmm.
would my ability to experience red, would that imply that I must have been able to experience other colors? Otherwise, how could red possibly feel the way it does, if feel like a color? If I were able to experience only one color, why would I call it red, right? It would just be, I don't know, like a color, a specific, yeah, whatever. If I weren't able to experience sound, then why would it even call it color? Why would I even say that that is visual compared to other modalities? So this whole
Mm-hmm.
question of thinking about the content of experience, the quality of experience in counterfactual terms, I think it's interesting, and it gets to the notion of information, and then on the postulate side, that's and composition side, that is where I think we can get all the tools to account for
Mm-hmm.
these questions, and also consider
Yep.
interesting thought experiments
Mm-hmm.
and scenarios.
Well, so you also prompted I think, a clarification that I should make, where I said once or twice that, for example, in this case, specificity is what's really part of the axiom itself, whereas things like differentiation and so on, these are consequences of. But I should actually clarify, when I say it's part of the axiom itself, what do we mean by that? Because I'm sure some people are listening thinking, wait a minute, you guys are using all sorts of thought experiments and inferences and whatever to make sense of these axioms or to justify them. But this example that Matteo just gave, I think, is a useful one to say of appearing out of out of nowhere and disappearing into nowhere and just having a split-second experience. We should remind listeners that when we analyze experiences in IIT, we're always trying to analyze a moment of experience, right? A time slice of experience, what we might call a single experience, right? The split second. And in doing so, of course, we're going to have to, use all sorts of executive functions to reflect on the experience that we're having. And of course, through reflecting, we're going to be changing the experience and, right? So all these things are true. We're also using inferences, we're using reasoning, all sorts of tools. But what we're trying to capture is always a single moment of experience, right? In a kind of caricatured sense, we could think of it as that kind of experience you just described, of like appearing out of nothing and disappearing into nothing. Or one could even say, for all we know, that's exactly what's happened to us right now, right? We just think that we have, all these memories or whatever, right? In the sense that the only thing we're really sure to be true is right here, right now, the experience that's happening. So when we assess an axiom, we're trying to assess the properties that are true immediately, right here, right now, right, in that experience. And in that context, something like differentiation would take us out of that. It would take us more into the realm of logical inference by comparing two different experiences. All right, moving on to integration. So our integration axiom says that experience is unitary. It is a whole, irreducible to separate experiences.
In simple terms, I think the idea of integration is relatively intuitive. It is the idea that when you have an experience, your experience is one. There's all the contents are co-experienced at the same time together. Like you're having a visual experience and an auditory experience. This is all part of one experience. And again, I'm appealing to the structure of experience and its contents, but in this case, just to say, well, it doesn't really make sense to say that your experience can be split in two. You can have unrelated contents of experience. You can be experiencing a sound and something that you are seeing that are completely unrelated to each other, but they are co-experienced. They are both components of your experience. And you can say,
And the fact that you can distinguish them when you introspect, this doesn't mean that they're two different experiences, right? This is I think the most typical misunderstanding of this idea, right? The fact that you can differentiate them in your experience through introspection. This doesn't contradict, as you say, that you're co-experiencing them.
right. And you can say they're both for you, they're both for the experience itself, and this you can appeal to intrinsicality, and you can ask the question, what would it mean if they weren't for the same experience? And then in that case you can say, well, they would be for two separate experiences, and in this case it would be two separate subjects of experience. And you could say maybe that's what happens when in a split brain scenario where you actually completely sever the connections between the two hemispheres, and you can have different contents that are not only unrelated but really not co-experienced. It's intuitive to think that those would be two separate experiences.
Yeah, no, I think about this word or adjective unitary. Like I feel like we went through many different possible words there, but I think the notion is that it's a whole. You know, it's a unified whole. It's a single experience, so to speak. We already brought in the information axiom that it is this one, right? It's this one, but there's one is already there, so floating in there, saying that it's one experience, right? But I think the idea of integration, or one major idea of integration, is that it is in fact an experience is necessarily an experience. It's a single experience. It's a unified whole experience that, again, might have a structure that contains many different things, many distinctions and many differences that make a difference, many types of contents, but they're always, in order to be one experience, they must be unified. And again, I think this is one of those axioms that seem very circular almost. It's in order to have an experience, it needs to be one. Well, yes, if it wasn't one, then it would be more than one, and then it wouldn't be an experience, it would be multiple experiences.
I also want to add that the idea that an experience is irreducible to separate experiences can mean also that, so right now, let's say I am having auditory experience and a visual experience, and the fact that I am one and I am experiencing both modalities is in a sense irreducible to the fact that there is just some auditory experience and just some visual experience going on. There's the fact that they are co-experienced. It's a different experience, right? Hearing both sound and seeing images. That is, it is this whole that is not just like the sum of the parts. And this is not just because there are relations between the sound and the images. It's just because they are co-experienced.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a difference between having an experience of pure sound and one of pure vision, and one that has sound and vision. These are different experiences.
I think in an FAQ on the wiki, Matteo, you had used an example of something like, if you look at a person speaking, right? For example, on Zoom, you experience the movement of their mouth and the sound of their voice more or less in unison. And so it's easy to understand that as being integrated or unitary as an experience, even though they're two different modalities. But then if there's a glitch in the Zoom and you see them, moving their lips, but then the sound has a lag or something, we might colloquially refer to that as, oh, it's no longer integrated, or it's fragmented, or not unitary anymore. But the point is, the asynchrony itself is also an integrated whole in your experience, right? That's like, right. That's what also has to come across here.
Yeah, I would call that more like there is a temporal relation in the first case where the things are in sync, but then these temporal relations are sort of like more loose, and there is a lag, or there's some difference between movements of the mouth and what you're seeing, and so they're unrelated or less related, but they're still
But they're still
co-experienced and
co-experienced,
still
precisely.
unified in one experience. Yes.
Right.
So
The experience, in
integrated.
fact, the experience of fragmentation or of disunity is itself a unitary experience, right? That's the key point to get across here. I feel I'm emphasizing that also just because of having seen and heard many very simple misinterpretations of what's meant by integration, right? Because again, like all the axioms, the point being made is really quite elementary.
I also want to mention that, again, in the philosophical debate, the unity of consciousness has been discussed widely, from Kant to a recent even book by Tim Bain that is all about the unity of consciousness. And I think it is relatively uncontroversial that there is something along the lines of integration. It's just called different names, and we are highlighting different aspects. But yes.
Another thing that actually, it's a bit of a foreshadowing thing, but again, I think it's interesting, Matteo, that when you were talking about, there is this difference between having a pure auditory and a pure visual experience and having the whole thing. But you were emphasizing, I am having the unified thing, right? Which implies what we will get to very shortly, which is the exclusion axiom, right? It's not that you are having, both the auditory as one experience and the visual as one experience and the separate unified experience. You're just having the unified experience.
Okay, so our next axiom is exclusion. And just to read it, it says, experience is definite. It is this whole.
Exclusion is, I think, historically one of the axioms that has been most hotly, what should I say, been people are against it or don't think that it's very, very intuitive at all, and people kind of balk at just having it as an axiom at all. But I think in this form that it is now in IIT 4.0, I think it just hints at this idea that any given experience is kind of well defined. It is this particular experience. It's not this particular experience and another. It's not this particular experience and another particular experience that has less content, for example. So indicating that it's not just unitary, being like all its components are stuck together as one experience, but it's actually only one experience. It's not simultaneously this whole experience and a whole experience that contains just half of the components, so to speak.
And maybe to connect it to the word exclusion itself, a wording that has been helpful for me to understand has been, with any content of experience that I articulate. So let's say I see this screen in front of me. I can then say also so the fact that I see the screen in front of me, this excludes my seeing a greater scene than the screen in front of me. And it also excludes my seeing only a portion of the screen in front of me, right? So the fact that I'm experiencing this experience of the screen with the precise border it has, with the precise contents that are in the experience, so this then excludes my experiencing less than what I'm experiencing, and it also excludes my experiencing more than what I'm experiencing.
The most intuitive way for me to put it, which is just rephrasing what you basically just said, is that it is interesting to notice that your experience has all these components. You are seeing something, you're hearing something, and as you say, you can ask yourself the question, why is my experience this and it is not also an experience of less than what it is? Like, why am I experiencing this package rather than a different package? And so this experience excludes an experience that is only visual, or an experience that it is only auditory, and also an experience that is more than what I'm experiencing.
But this kind of sounds, very close to the information axiom, that this experience is the specific way it is.
Yeah, so we have an
Mm.
FAQ in the wiki that covers the difference between specificity and indefiniteness, so information and exclusion. To me, one way to describe it is that, again, as always, the axioms are a package. They sort of come together and they build on top of each other. They are connected. In particular, I think information and exclusion are close because they are both talking about the experience and its content before, so to speak, considering composition, like before looking at the components, but just the content of the experience as a whole. And information says it is what it is specific, but it's almost as if, for me at least, that's my way to understanding it, is it says its content is specific, it is what it is, without necessarily saying what the borders of the content are, what is included and what is excluded, so to speak. Whereas like exclusion gets to that part. It could be still specific, but it could be less than what it is, or it could be more than what it is, and it isn't. Yeah.
And also the etymology of these terms, I think, is a helpful reminder for this, where the fine indefinite means border, and so you can think of this, in simple terms as saying experience has the border it has, right? It's delimited in the specific way it's delimited. I probably shouldn't say specific there. In the particular way it's delimited.
But I think
so
also it's interesting also, like this etymology with fine, as you said, like being one way that I think of it is that the experience is finite in some way, right? It's finite. It's not infinite, or yeah, I would at least say so. It's finite in the contents that it has, and that kind of. I personally don't like this notion of the border so much, because the border is not something that is in the experience, right? The border is just saying that there are contents that are in and contents that are out, so to speak, right? And the border itself brings something else that is not actually part of the experience. So I think this.
You mean because if I can interrupt, because the fact of having a border or introspecting a border, you're kind of, let's say, cheating by the rules of introspection, because if you have a border, then it means you know something that's outside of it. Is that what you're getting at, Björn?
Yeah, maybe something
Whereas
like
through
that.
introspection, you don't actually know what's outside of that border.
Yeah, but yeah, it's more like just this, I think, simple-minded notion that it's finite. It's maybe a better word for me than border is that it's bounded. It's like it has, it doesn't have all the possible contents that it could have had, so to speak, right? It so to speak, it's like it doesn't extend into the infinity. It extends only so far as it extends, and that's it ends somewhere, so to speak. It's bounded. It's limited. It's finite. It's not unbounded, infinite or infinite. Is it? Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe indefinite is
indefinite
is
probably probably
term. But yeah, so the aspect that you both pointed out, I think we can express it as, just like in the information postulate, we have, so to speak, the positive intrinsic aspect of the axiom, which in this case is, my experience contains what it contains, and then we have, just like for information, we mentioned that the notion of differentiation was an inference that is, in a sense, stepping out of the axiom per se, and introspection and intrinsic realm per se. For exclusion, we can also do something like that. We can infer that by virtue of being the content that it has right now, then it is not including more than it could, or this kind of thing. So for instance, I can imagine my visual space being bigger, or I can imagine me seeing more than I'm seeing right now, just like I can imagine me seeing something different from what I'm seeing right now for information.
Right.
And I think another way to distinguish between information and exclusion is that, we talked about this with the specificity being as opposed to genericness. So the experience is specific as opposed to being generic. That kind of is the information part, whilst exclusion is that the experience is not only specific, but it's also kind of well-defined or definite in its in what it contains, right? It's not that it contains these specific things and some other specific things, or that it contains these specific things and in addition some lesser subset, so to speak.
Right, and if you want to draw the contrast, as you were doing, of it's specific, not generic on the information side, and with the exclusion side, you could then say it is definite, not infinite, right? Or it's bounded, not unbounded.
Unbounded, yeah.
Something like that. And also, Matteo, if I can follow up on Matteo's point of what aspects of this are really strictly part of the axiom per se, meaning, as I jokingly called, sort of by the rules of introspection here, and not going beyond really what you can introspect in a single time slice of experience, right? So you have to, so this is also represented, I think, graphically in the way we show this axiom. I think we'll throw it up probably at the end of the episode, but it's easy to visualize that we can be sure of exclusion. We can casually call it exclusion down or something like that, or exclusion within or something, that my experience now excludes my having a lesser experience than what I have, right? It excludes my having less than the contents that my experience contains or has. And then only by inference does it then exclude my having more than what I'm having right now. And we show this on the image where my experience excludes my, or my visual experience right now excludes my also experiencing visual content at the back of my head, for example, which I can't see. So those are out of my experience. But we should be clear that those, that part of when we talk about the axiom, it is indeed an inference one step further, right? The same way as Matteo was pointing out, the same way something like differentiation is an inference where we use reasoning to reason from the axiom to some, let's say, very closely bound implications, but they're beyond introspection nevertheless. This would then be a similar case with the exclusion axiom. All right, so our final axiom is composition. And just to read it out, it says the following. Experience is structured. It is composed of distinctions and the relations that bind them together, yielding a phenomenal structure that feels the way it feels. So this one is a bit longer than the others, and there are a few more moving parts, a few more terms that we're also introducing. So let us unpack this little by little. So the first part of this, the first clause just says experience is structured. Why don't we start with that before we get into too much jargon and just present in kind of simplistic terms what we mean by this?
Yeah, so what we mean by structure is that experience has content, and this content is, we can name components of our experience. It is not usually, at least we go into limit cases that we will discuss eventually, but usually we can name components of our experience. For instance, we can say, like we've been doing it all along, we can say part of my experience is visual content. I can see colors and shapes, and part of my experience is auditory. I can hear sounds and I have feeling of my body. And all these things are contents that we can name and distinguish from each other, but also they are related. And that's really what makes it a structure. There are components and there are relations between these components. So what do we mean by they're related? Well, we can say things like when I see a face, for instance, I see Jeremiah's face on my screen, it is in the top half of the screen. So there is a part of space that happens to also overlap with the image of a face. And similarly, when I hear some sounds, I also see your mouth moving, and these things seem to be related. They happen at the same time. They, for instance, it feels like the sound is coming from you because you're moving your mouth, and things like that. We can also go a little deeper. We can say, even when we see something like a face and we call that one component or one distinction, something that we can distinguish, we can introspect that this component is actually composed of further components. A face has some colors and some edges, and it has a shape, and it has components like eyes and a mouth that themselves are made out of these lower level features, we can call them, which is colors and edges, and they stand in spatial relations to each other. For instance, the eyes are above the mouth and they are closer, etc. So this is when we talk about the structure of experience, we mean all these components and how they are related, and all experiences have this property of being composed, being structured.
And I think it's interesting. One of the examples you brought up now is like the auditory experience or contents of hearing you speak are related to your mouth, seeing your mouth moving. And I think it's fascinating in this example right here, because right now, when you see my mouth moving on your screen and you hear my voice, it's not, actually, it's interesting because in this particular example right now, in our context, the sound isn't actually, I'm doing scare quotes here, it's not actually coming from my mouth, for you, it's just coming through your headphones, right? And it's just in your experience, intrinsically for you, it is these two components become related or are related in such a way that your experience feels as though the sound is coming from my mouth, right? It's the experience that is structured in this way, right? And it's the way, the reason for that is to be found in my substrate or in my brain, right? It's not to be found in the structure of the world, so to speak. And it's so the structure of my experience is such that, these two components are related in such a way that the way they appear to me is that there is a sound coming from your mouth,
Yeah, this is a good point. Of course, the experience has its structure, and the distinctions and relations can be independent from what's actually going on out there in the world. But as you point out, most of the time they actually reflect, we can say, the causal structure of the world. We can say,
sure.
Yeah, of course, we can do all sorts of tricks. Yeah, but you're right, and this is also in particular true, and I think it's worth pointing out because, for instance, if I were dreaming of, I don't know, a person that maybe I don't know, I don't even know, it's somebody I made up giving a speech, and I would have this experience of them talking and the sound coming from them and me hearing the voice and seeing the mouth moving, the lips moving. Well, this would still be a completely legitimate experience with distinctions and relations, but it would just be completely internally generated and intrinsic, and not reflect anything out there in the world.
Yeah. And I like the notion of the dream, right? Because the dream would still have this. So let's say you were just having a dream that so happened to have this exact contents that, or this felt to you in the exact way that your experience right now feels, right? And that experience would be structured in the same way, and it would have the same meaning to you as a subject as it does. So kind of the structure here is in fact the meaning of the experience. Like the experience means what it does by virtue of the way the contents are structured.
Well, and that's the final bit of the way this axiom is phrased. It really captures what you're getting at here, Björn, where we say the distinctions and relations that structure our experience yield what we call a phenomenal structure that feels the way it feels, right?
Yeah. And it means what it means.
Yeah, exactly. By virtue of feeling the way it feels. Yeah, exactly. So as a teaser to some episode far in the future, we'll certainly talk about what meaning is. And a phrase that we often use in IIT is that the feeling is the meaning. So for completeness sake, we should probably offer or perform our test of the axiom, I think, with composition also. Again, the way to test this as an axiom is to try to imagine an experience that weren't composed, right? That weren't structured somehow.
That had no components. I would kind of offer.
Okay, that didn't have any components.
I would say that in IIT terms, an experience is always composed. It always has structure, and this applies to the majority of experiences we have. The reason is already by just having some different components such as sounds and images and colors and emotions. These are all components. So it's very natural for us to describe every experience as having structure. The claim of IIT is that the axioms have to apply to every conceivable experience. And of course, then we can go to the limit cases where we ask the question, but what if I had fewer and fewer components? And of course, everything still applies until we have, let's say, at least two components. Like I can imagine having an experience that has two components, and I can say, well, it is structured this way with these two components, and another experience is structured a different way because those two components are flipped or different, or but then the same reasoning applies really to also, you could imagine experiences with one component. You can still say something has structure if I imagine, I don't know, something like a stool that is made of just a block of wood, or it's just a block of granite. I can still say, well, they are structured differently. They are two different objects in this case because they are one thing, but they are different in nature. And similarly, you could imagine an experience of the taste of sweetness and an experience of the color red. Even if that was the only component they had, you could still say they are structured differently because they have only one component and it is different. Now, in phenomenology,
but wouldn't you have to? Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but when we apply this axiom, we don't apply it in a comparative sense of comparing pure sourness and pure redness,
right,
or pure dotness or something like that. So you have to apply it to the pure conceivable experience that is the one component experience.
Yeah, so
Right?
I think, to my mind, the idea to say that even an experience of pure sweetness, it is still structured, even if it has only this sweetness component, is that, well, why does sweetness feel the way it does? Well, because it is internally, it feels one way, and it is a different thing that, for instance, bitterness, right? So there must be some further structure, or even just like a relational aspect of this thing with itself, or with something else that makes it feel the way it does. But what I'm trying to say is that here we really hit the wall of a very, very far removed thought experiment that explores a limit case.
But we have to do that we have to do that for to properly test the axiom, right? You have to go into such a limit case.
Right. So, but the axiom has two parts, so to speak. One is really to talk about the fact that a structure, for an experience to be structured, it means to have content, and in this case, it's at least one component. You can't have an experience that is completely empty of any feeling. There must be at least one feeling, right? It must feel one way, and that's already saying, okay, these type of experiences we're talking about would satisfy this criterion. The second part, we can argue whether being structured means to have at least one component and one relation, or two components and one relation between them. But I think on one hand, this will become clear when we try to translate this in physical terms, because we can actually talk about the substrate of the experience of pure sweetness, or the substrate of an experience of something that feels one way. And we can realize that in order to have an experience that feels one way, we need some mechanisms that have at least two states that specify at least a cause and an effect and have a relation between them. So it's actually more structure that we can unpack on the physical side that explains why a single component of experience feels the way it does. And therefore we can say it is structured. But purely on the phenomenon side, I think it's still justified to say that even if an experience has content in terms of one single component, if that component feels the way it does, how can it possibly feel the way it does? If there's no other reason, the reason must be because it is internally structured that specific way, or qualitatively, it is one way rather than a different way, and that is still structure.
Okay, so you guys, it sounds like that I hear both of you saying that the proper way to apply this thought experiment is to say, let us imagine an experience that has no component, right? A componentless experience. If I imagine that, that's simply no experience at all. Therefore, every conceivable experience has components, or at least a component, right? In other words,
Yes.
every conceivable experience is structured in some no matter how minimal way.
Yeah, so it is that if it must have at least one component, and for that component to feel the way it does, and in a sense to feel different from other things, well, there must be a reason why it feels this way and not a different way. And what can it be? If there's nothing else except that component, it must be something about that component that makes it feel this way and not that way. And if it is sweetness rather than redness, then there must be a reason why they are different, and the only reason can be within them, so to speak, in what they are made of, or what they are intrinsically.
But we should say that those extra steps of comparing experiences, they somehow take us beyond the axiom itself, right?
Yeah.
So the test of the axiom is actually it's very humble, right? It's just that super humble test of imagining a componentless experience, right? Which is no experience at all. In the interest of time, though, we should probably wrap this episode up. I think it's gotten quite long by now. So I'm gonna to wrap up. I have a little proposal that I'm gonna just share my screen.
For all your listeners, you should go to the wiki.
Go to the
I guess.
YouTube, or just go to the wiki page. That's just the axiom postulate overview. So today we've gone through the 5 axioms, and previous episode we talked about the 0th. And so just as a way to wrap up all these axioms as a package, and maybe to give a hint of where we're going in future episodes, how do we depict these things, right, as sort of reminders, as visual reminders? Well, the existence axiom, we simply have a picture of somebody lying on a bed, to demonstrate that experience exists immediately and irrefutably. Of course, this is very limited because it's only showing a visual experience, but that's what that's meant to represent. Guys, is it okay if I just zip through the left side, basically, or do you want to say?
No, you can just say that on the right side we have like the simplistic visualization that will also be like a guiding, helping graphic that we will use throughout the wiki for representing the corresponding postulates, right? You don't have to go into detail about them here. Yeah,
precisely. In the future episodes, we'll talk about what's on the right side, but what we'll be doing is then trying to translate this principle depicted on the left side, the phenomenological property that we'll show on the left side, into physical terms. So then, to briefly recap our 5 axioms from today, we had intrinsicality, which we depict as this halo around the experience. How on earth are you supposed to depict intrinsicality? That's the best that we came up with. If anyone has a better idea, feel free to email us. But in any case, so we just try to depict it with this halo around that experience, is for itself, or that it has this perspective, at least how I like to say it. Sorry, Björn, I know you don't like that phrasing as much.
It's fine.
Right, and then we'll see this enacted on the side of cause-effect power. The information axiom says that experience is specific, and our way of depicting this is actually cheating a bit, because again, how do you depict the concept that information is specific? Well, we're cheating in the sense that we revert to the notion of differentiation to depict this. And as we said in our talk about it, this is actually an inference from the axiom itself of specificity. But we, for lack of a better way of depicting, try to indicate here that this experience is what it is. And by virtue of being what it is also not what it's not, meaning it's differentiated from countless other possible experiences that one could be having.
Yeah, and it would have been difficult also to present a generic version, right? Which would have been the optimal thing, because the moment you kind of make a picture of a so-called generic experience, it's just a kind of a blurry but yet specific one, right? Precisely. So it's a problem. So yeah.
And in integration, we did try to depict the counterfactual to say experience is integrated. It's a experience is unitary. Try to imagine an experience that weren't unitary. That's what we're trying to show with these little cutouts behind it, which of course is absurd, or it leads to an absurdity. So that's what we're depicting, is the integrated experience versus the counterfactual here, which is simply not possible.
Yeah,
And
or it
each
would
of
just
them
be
would be
two.
an experience itself.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
Would be two
two
separate
experiences.
experiences. Yeah,
Separate
better
experience,
said.
each of them. Yeah.
Which would, and this would be quite a weird experience. Well, I guess it's with the experience of hemi-neglect, perhaps, but that
Maybe.
itself would just be,
Yeah,
you
or
know, half
maybe
of the
split
visual
brain.
sphere.
You know, yeah.
But if it
Maybe
were
it would-
split brain, it would be two different experiences, right?
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
to
So
be
that's
so
clear
the
with people.
each of
exactly.
them. Is
Each
an
of them would
experience, yeah.
like the yes, exactly, right.
Yeah. And then with exclusion, as I clumsily, I think, tried to describe, you know, this blue here is indicating this is the border of our experience. If you don't like the word border, this is, let's say, the boundary, or our experience is bounded. Maybe we don't say by the
Ah, that's
border
fine.
per se, but we do depict more or less a border. And what's shown on the inside is to try to say the fact that I'm experiencing my experience with the border it has, that excludes my experiencing, for example, only the right side of space and not both the right and the left side together. Similarly, it excludes my experiencing also the visual experience that goes beyond the periphery of my visual sphere, for example, what's happening behind my head. So that's what's trying to be indicated by these, let's say, counterfactual depictions with the gray dots there. And then here, this is a crude, for composition, it's a crude depiction of components of experience. So in crude terms, I can distinguish a shoe here or a foot. I can distinguish, you know, a book here. I can distinguish a hand here. And I can also notice that these different very coarse distinctions are related in different ways. So you see that these distinctions also overlap. So I can also see book and hand being related in my experience. Okay, and as we said, each of these ideas we're going to then translate to, you know, to cause-effect power, and we'll do that starting in the next episode. So do you guys have any parting words for our listeners?
Try to get over the fact that these are so extremely simplistic and seemingly circular and kind of just
see that as a virtue.
Yeah, try, because it's really, I think it's really, really difficult. And we've spent a lot of time of trying to kind of get at the bare bones description of it. And it becomes, you know, seemingly circular. And I think you often use this analogy of trying to, you know, what's the fish out of water type analogy.
Explain to a fish what water is, right? It's so,
yeah, right. It's just
so
always
omnipresent
there, right?
and pervasive that they wouldn't even think that it's a thing to explain.
Right, it's just there, right? And it's, so I think that for
an
me
analogy that Giulio uses sometimes for the axioms is to say, you know, imagine suddenly discovering that you've been always looking at the world through a perfectly clear glass window, and you just never knew that the window were there, even though everything you've experienced has been, you know, looking through that perfectly clear glass window. You know, the axioms are like that, where they're so obvious, they're so right in front of our nose that it's easy to think of them as being, let's say, just trivial. But
I think
it's
triviality
so obvious.
is a benefit, it's a virtue, right? Like you said, it's supposed to be basically trivial. It's like obvious. That's the hope, right? That someone will think, oh, well, obviously it's like that, if you know what I mean. That's kind of the point. It's supposed to be, eventually, once you consider it, it should be like, oh, well, obvious. Oh, is that all they mean? You know, well, obviously experiences are like that. You know, if one experience was two, then it wouldn't be one, it's two. You know, well, obviously. Oh, if my experience had more than it had, then it would be that other thing that had more. Well, obviously, you know, it's the kind of, I think that's what I hope people will get to. And if they have other, I would really love it if people would try to like write to us or use the wiki comment section to be like, well, how about this other obvious but you know, property that you seem to have forgotten? You know, that would be great. I would love to hear suggestions and inputs.
Excellent. All right, then. Should we wrap up for today?
Yeah, I'm like half an hour late, so that would be great.
Okay. All right. So we'll talk to you next time.
Yeah. See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.